What would you do if you saw your former teacher, someone who once believed in you when no one else did, getting thrown out onto the street with nothing but a suitcase and a memory? That's exactly what happened to John Wick. But this isn't the John Wick you think you know. This time, the fight isn't with fists. It's with something far more powerful. Stay with us because what happens next will restore your faith in justice. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like, share this video, and hit that subscribe button to help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Your support means the world to us, and it keeps us going so we can bring you more meaningful stories like this one. The afternoon sky hung low and gray, pressing gently against the rooftops of the old neighborhood. A soft breeze stirred dry leaves along the sidewalk, carrying the faint chime of school bells in the distance. John Wick walked without purpose, his hands in the pockets of his dark coat, the collar turned slightly up against the wind. He didn't stand out here. Not anymore. Not in these quiet streets lined with cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences. The neighborhood looked tired but familiar. The kind of place where time didn't hurry, just wore everything down little by little. As he passed the corner gas station long since shuttered, his eyes caught the rusted sign of Jefferson High School. The gate was half open, its metal frame clinging to what was left of a blue and white banner that read "Home of the Tigers." He stopped walking for a moment. He let out a quiet breath and kept walking, turning down a side street that ran parallel to the schoolyard. At the end of the block, just past a broken street lamp, he spotted a narrow alley. For a second he hesitated. Then his feet moved, almost on their own. The alley wasn't anything special, just a narrow strip of cracked asphalt hemmed in by red brick walls. But something about it felt known, like a passageway into a version of himself he rarely let out. The walls were tagged with faded graffiti, names of kids who had probably long since left town. An old milk crate lay turned over near a rusted bike frame. A black and white cat darted out from behind a dumpster, its tail flicking in irritation. He walked slowly. This alley had once been the quickest way to cut class, to sneak out during lunch, to meet a friend without the teachers noticing. Now it felt quieter, more hollow. Each step stirred memories he hadn't asked for: laughter, anger, a girl's voice calling his name, the sound of his own breath after running from the assistant principal. But this walk wasn't about nostalgia, not really. He wasn't trying to reconnect. He was trying to feel something again. Anything, since everything had gone quiet inside him. Even the gunfire hadn't been enough to stir the stillness. About halfway down the alley, a sudden crash split the silence. The sharp, brittle sound of ceramic shattering against concrete. Then a man's voice, loud and sharp. "You think I'm running a charity? You're 3 months behind? Get out." A woman's voice followed, thin, barely audible, shaking. "Please, I just need a little more time." John stopped. The sound came from the back courtyard of a small apartment building that butted up against the alley. He moved silently toward the edge, keeping close to the wall. When he reached the end of the alley, he stepped behind an old telephone pole, out of sight. In the courtyard below, a man in his 40s stood at the top of a stairwell, his face red with anger. A broken plate lay in pieces on the ground near the steps. He held a trash bag in one hand and flung it toward the base of the stairs. A woman, small, with gray-streaked hair tied back in a loose knot, stood at the bottom, trying to gather a handful of items that had spilled from an old cardboard box. Her shoulders were hunched. She didn't plead with her voice anymore, just with her hands, moving slowly, carefully, as if she were afraid of breaking even more than she already had. John narrowed his eyes, leaning slightly forward, trying to hear more. "You said that last month?" the man snapped. "This ain't my problem. You don't pay, you don't stay. Simple." He turned and disappeared back into the apartment, slamming the door behind him. The woman froze for a second, standing alone in the middle of the concrete courtyard, surrounded by scattered items: an old lamp, a small suitcase, a torn blanket. Slowly, she bent down and started picking things up. Her hands trembled. John watched, unmoving. The whole scene had lasted maybe a minute, but it stirred something in him, something dull and heavy. This wasn't a shootout. No one was in danger of being killed. But the weight in the woman's silence, the way her shoulders curled inward, it reminded him of something. Not a face, not yet. Just a feeling, a moment maybe from years ago, a classroom. A voice. He stayed hidden, eyes following her as she placed a framed photo back into a bag with great care, brushing the glass with her sleeve. It looked like it meant something to her. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of damp earth and old leaves. Somewhere behind him, the school bell rang again. John didn't move. He just watched. Something was pulling at the edge of his memory, like a thread waiting to be pulled. Whatever this was, it wasn't just someone else's problem. Not anymore. And as the woman sat down on the bottom step, cradling a plastic bag in her lap, like it held pieces of her life, he felt the stirrings of something that had nothing to do with revenge or violence. It was quieter than that, but just as fierce. He stepped back into the shadows, his mind already moving, even if he didn't know where it was taking him yet. The rain had held off, but the sky threatened otherwise. Low clouds pressed over the rooftops like a lid. In the courtyard behind the row of brick apartments, the tension was already thick before John stepped closer. The layout was simple, just a small shared space surrounded by aging units, each with a faded door and crooked blinds. Patches of dead grass clung between the slabs of concrete, and a sagging clothesline ran from one balcony to the next. From above, a man stood at the top of the stairwell, one hand gripping the railing, the other flinging a folding chair down the steps. It landed with a dull thud near the woman at the bottom. She was slight, no more than 5'3", and bundled in a faded wool coat too large for her frame. Her silver hair was pulled into a shaky bun, and her shoes looked like they'd walked too many winters. She clutched a handbag to her chest, her lips tight, eyes focused on the man above her. 3 months, the man snapped, pointing a finger down at her. 3 months I've waited. That's it. I'm done. You're out today. I'm trying, the woman stammered. Her voice was low, like she wasn't used to raising it. I called about a loan. They said I might hear something this week. You said that last week? I'm not running a damn soup kitchen here. He bent down, grabbed a stack of books, and hurled them one by one toward the landing. A framed picture cracked on the concrete, the glass splintering into thick, jagged lines. A pair of socks fluttered beside it like fallen petals. She flinched but didn't protest again. Instead, she bent to retrieve the frame. Her hands were careful, almost reverent, like it was the only thing that hadn't let her down. John remained still, one foot slightly forward, arms relaxed but ready. His eyes tracked the man, then the woman, then the quiet windows above. A few curtains moved. No one came out. No one said a word. The man turned back inside, muttering under his breath, and slammed the door behind him. The courtyard fell quiet, except for the scuffle of the woman's shoes as she stepped carefully over a dropped blanket and knelt to gather what she could. John's jaw tensed. His fingers twitched once at his side. This wasn't the kind of scene he usually got involved in. There were no threats to his life, no enemies chasing him through alleyways. But still, something in him refused to walk away. She reached down to pick up the broken photo frame, turning it over in her hands. That's when she looked up, and for the first time, he saw her face. His breath caught. The years had softened her features, drawn fine lines around her mouth and eyes, but there was no mistaking who she was. Eleanor Graves. The name came without effort, like it had just been waiting for a reason to return. His old literature teacher. 11th grade. She'd worn long skirts and cardigans with elbow patches. Carried books like they were living things. She was the one who had called his essays honest, even when they were angry. She had looked at him like he was a puzzle worth solving, not a delinquent to be dismissed. And now she was being tossed out like she didn't matter, like she was furniture past its usefulness. A memory surfaced, not slowly, but all at once. Him, 17, sitting on a bench outside the principal's office with a bloody nose and a bad attitude. Miss Graves beside him, not scolding, not asking what he had done, but instead handing him a worn paperback. It was the Count of Monte Cristo. She had smiled gently and said, "You don't have to fight the world, John. Let your mind fight for you. There's justice, even if it hides for a while." That day he'd scoffed. But he took the book, he read it. Twice. He never gave it back. Now here she was, fighting her own quiet battle and losing. The anger that began to stir inside him wasn't the white-hot rage he'd known before. It didn't demand action. Not yet. But it was heavy, rooted, personal. He stepped forward slowly but firmly and left the shadows behind. Miss Graves was trying to lift a torn shoebox filled with papers. She didn't see him until he spoke. "Miss Graves?" She paused, one hand still gripping the box, then looked up. At first, her eyes didn't register him, then they widened. The confusion was quick, replaced by disbelief, and then something soft, recognition. "John? John Wick?" He gave a slight nod, but his voice didn't follow. For a second, they just stared at each other, the broken pieces of her life between them. He took another step closer, and she stood there holding her memories in cardboard and cloth, still and stunned, as if the years between them had just folded in half. Eleanor didn't speak at first. Her lips parted like she meant to, but the words didn't come. John saw the tremble in her jaw before she could hide it. Her eyes, though tired and rimmed with red, still carried a trace of the same calm strength he remembered from that classroom all those years ago. She blinked, then finally managed to whisper, "John Wick. I never imagined I'd see you again." He offered the faintest nod and stepped closer, kneeling beside the scattered pieces of her life. He didn't rush. One by one, he placed books back into the box, folded a blanket, picked up a cracked mug that had somehow stayed in one piece. His movements were quiet, deliberate, almost delicate. Nothing about him resembled the name that followed him like a shadow. Eleanor tried to stoop down, but her knees gave her trouble. John noticed and gently motioned for her to let him handle it. She hesitated, then let out a sigh and stood back, arms wrapped around herself for warmth or protection, maybe both. Once everything was gathered, he picked up the box and nodded toward the sidewalk. "Let's get off the concrete." There was a bench under a scraggly tree not far from the alley. It faced an empty lot where kids once played basketball, now just cracked pavement and weeds. He placed the box beside her and sat quietly on the far end of the bench. The silence stretched between them for a minute, filled with the distant hum of traffic and a few chirps from a bird perched nearby. "I'm sorry you saw that," she said finally, smoothing the front of her coat. "It's not how I wanted to run into anyone, especially not one of my former students." John turned slightly toward her. "You have nothing to be sorry for." She smiled, but it was a tired smile. "I fell behind on rent. 3 months. I've been trying to get help, but it's not easy. The pension doesn't go far anymore. Groceries, medication, bills, they all add up. I guess Mr. Halder decided he'd waited long enough." "That was the landlord?" John asked. She nodded. "Terry Halder. His father used to run the place before he passed. Terry's different. Doesn't like to hear stories. Just wants the check." Her fingers clutched the handle of her handbag as she looked out across the lot. "I never had kids of my own. My brother passed a few years ago and his family moved out to Nevada. I've always managed fine. This time just got away from me." John didn't respond right away. He stared at the box beside them. Tucked between a stack of papers and a folded scarf, something familiar peeked out. He reached in gently and pulled out a worn paperback, its cover faded to soft gray, the edges curled and stained from use. The Count of Monte Cristo. He turned it in his hands, careful not to tear the fragile spine. "You kept it." She looked over, her eyes glistening. "Of course I did. That book meant something to me. Still does. I gave it to you because I saw a part of Edmond Dantes in you fighting the world without knowing who your real enemies were." He set the book in her lap. "I never gave it back." "I didn't expect you to," she said with a soft chuckle. "I always hoped one of my students would do something meaningful with their life. You became a legend." He met her eyes, but his didn't carry pride. There was something else there. Something heavier. "I became something. But not what you think." Eleanor reached out and laid a hand gently on his arm. "Even if it wasn't the life I imagined for you, I always believed you had a good heart, buried under all that pain, and I still do." He looked down, jaw clenched, his thoughts darting between past and present. He remembered the afternoons she stayed after class to help the kids no one else had time for. The way she always left a light on in her room for anyone who needed to talk. How she once slipped him $20 for bus fare, pretending it was an old refund from a field trip. All those years, all that quiet service, and now she was sitting on a bench with her life in a basket, her dignity cracked like the frame on that photo. "This isn't right," he muttered. "It's just life," she said softly. "We all have to face it eventually." John shook his head. "You helped me when no one else did. When everyone else saw trouble, you saw something worth saving." "I haven't forgotten that." She sat up straighter, suddenly cautious. "John, I appreciate you being here, I really do. But I'm not looking for pity. I'm not a charity case." "It's not charity," he said, his voice steady. "It's gratitude and justice." She opened her mouth to object again, but he raised a hand not harshly. Just enough to let her know the conversation had shifted. He wasn't asking. "I know a place," he said, quiet, clean, and warm. "You can stay there tonight, no strings attached. Just a roof and a door that locks." Eleanor hesitated. "I don't want to be a burden." "You're not," he said simply. He made a quick call on his phone, speaking softly into the receiver. The person on the other end didn't argue. It was a favor long overdue. When he hung up, he turned back to her. "Come on. Let's get you out of the cold." The ride across town was quiet. Eleanor looked out the window, her fingers pressed together in her lap. Every so often she glanced at John, as if to make sure he was really there. The guest house was tucked behind a small chapel, run by a family John had once protected in another life. They didn't ask questions, just handed him a key and a smile. Inside, the room was small but warm, a twin bed with clean sheets, a lamp beside it, a worn armchair in the corner, and a pot of soup already warming on the stove. Eleanor stepped inside and paused. Her shoulders dropped a little. She turned to face him, her eyes wet but not from fear. "I didn't know where I was going to sleep tonight," she said quietly, "but I never expected this." "You deserve better," he replied. She gave him a look of something close to peace. "For the first time in a long while, I feel safe." John didn't respond. He just nodded and stepped back into the night, the door closing gently behind him. The morning air felt softer, touched by the warmth of early sunlight pushing through a pale gray sky. John stepped out of the guest house before most of the city had woken up. A few cars passed on the quiet road. He didn't look around much, didn't pause to take in the scene. He already knew where he was going. He arrived at the real estate office just after they opened. The woman at the desk, whose nameplate read Valerie, greeted him with a polite smile that faded into quiet efficiency when she saw the look in his eyes. He didn't waste time. He gave her a location in Older. Quiet neighborhood with big trees and one-story buildings where the mailboxes still sat in neat rows by the curb. "I want something small, ground floor, good light," he said. Valerie clicked through listings, nodding slowly. "Unfurnished or furnished," he said, "and prepaid 1 year. Utilities included?" She glanced up, eyebrows raised slightly. "For yourself?" "No," he replied. "For someone who deserves better than what she's been handed." After some back and forth, she showed him a modest place with warm wood floors, pale curtains, and a little patio facing a rose bush. The rent was reasonable. The landlord lived 2 doors down and kept the place clean. "I'll take it," he said. "You sure you don't want to see it first?" "I've seen enough to know this will do." He paid in full. "No negotiations, no delays?" As he signed the lease under his own name, a thought crossed his mind, not of obligation, not of duty, but of clarity. This wasn't about doing something heroic. It was about making something right, no matter how long overdue. By mid-morning, he made his way back across town, cutting through side streets until he reached the alley where it had all started. The back courtyard still looked the same, though quieter now. A few cardboard boxes sat stacked beside the steps. Eleanor's remaining things. Carefully arranged, labeled in her handwriting. She had always been neat, even when the world around her wasn't. As he bent to lift the boxes, the door above creaked open. Terry Halder stepped out, coffee mug in one hand, annoyance already settled on his face. "You again," he muttered. "Thought you'd had your little rescue moment yesterday." John didn't look up. He kept stacking the boxes, slow and steady. "She left this morning," Terry went on, sipping from the mug. "Didn't even say goodbye?" "Not that I expected her to." John stood upright, box in his arms. He looked up at Terry, not with anger, not even disdain, just something flat and unreadable. "You don't know what she's done for people," he said quietly. Terry rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on. Don't start preaching. She's just another broke old woman who stayed too long in a city that moved past her." "You think that makes her worthless?" John asked. "And you? You're just wasting your time playing savior. She's not your problem." There was a pause, the kind that settled in the bones, thick and cold. John set the box down, walked up a few steps until they stood nearly eye to eye. "The world runs because of people like her," he said, voice calm but deep. "Teachers, nurses, people who give more than they take, people who keep others from falling apart." He leaned in slightly, just enough to lower his voice. "You just live in it." Terry's mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out. His grip on the mug tightened. He looked away first, muttered something under his breath, and retreated inside without another word. John turned back, picked up the boxes, and carried them to the car waiting by the curb. Later that night, after Eleanor was settled into her new apartment, after she'd unpacked her blankets and placed her books on the shelf, just so John sat alone in the small courtyard behind the guest house. It wasn't much. A few plastic chairs, a potted plant with too many dead leaves, and a quiet that felt more comfortable than silence usually did. He lit a small fire in the metal drum by the corner and stared into it, the flickering light catching faintly in his eyes. He thought about all the people like Eleanor. The ones who built the world in pieces, one lesson, one patient, one shift at a time, then were forgotten when they slowed down. He wondered how many more were sitting in tiny rooms tonight, alone, believing they no longer mattered. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the itch that usually came after he helped someone, the restlessness. The need to keep moving. This was different. It didn't feel like a job. It felt like something settling into place. The next morning, Eleanor met him on the patio of her new home with a small envelope in her hands. She wore a blue cardigan buttoned to the top, and her hair was pulled back neatly. Her posture was straighter, her steps more certain. "I wrote you something," she said, handing him the envelope. He opened it there, no ceremony. The handwriting was elegant, slanted slightly, just like he remembered from the notes she used to leave on their essays. "To my student John," it began. "You found justice not in revenge, but in remembrance. You remembered who I was, what I gave. That means more than I can say. Thank you for seeing me when it mattered." He folded the letter and slipped it into his coat pocket, his fingers pressing over it for a moment longer than necessary. Then his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something made him swipe to read the message. "I heard what you did for Miss Graves. We need to talk. She's not the only one who needs help." The name below was one he hadn't seen since graduation. David Lynn, another old classmate. One John barely remembered, quiet, smart, always carried a legal pad in his backpack. John stared at the message, then back at Eleanor as she watered the roses outside her window, humming softly to herself. Maybe this wasn't just about her anymore. Maybe it never was. The cafe was tucked into the corner of a quiet intersection, the kind of place with scuffed floors, too many plants, and a soft jazz playlist that never seemed to end. John sat at a small table near the window, a cup of black coffee untouched in front of him. He didn't like meeting in public, but something about this felt different. This wasn't business. It wasn't danger. It was something in between. David Lynn walked in 5 minutes late, dressed in a navy blazer over a sweater and collared shirt. His glasses fogged slightly from the outside chill, and he wiped them absently as he scanned the room. When he spotted John, he hesitated just a moment, then walked over, extending his hand. "I almost didn't believe it was really you," he said. "But that picture? Even with half your face hidden, it was pretty obvious." John shook his hand without standing. "Been a long time." David sat, pulling out his phone and setting it face down on the table. "I saw the photo online. Someone snapped it when Miss Graves was leaving the old apartment. I recognized her first. Then I saw you carrying her things. I had to know if it was really you." John didn't answer right away. He stared out the window, where the light filtered through tree branches just beginning to bloom. "She helped me," David said after a pause. "Senior year? My dad got laid off. My mom cleaned houses. I didn't think college was even on the table. Miss Graves walked me through the whole scholarship process, essays, forms, deadlines, everything. She even wrote me 3 letters of recommendation. He laughed quietly. I got a full ride, law school too. She changed everything for me. John looked back at him. So why didn't anyone check in on her? David winced. Because we all moved on. We became someone. And she stayed behind, teaching, living alone. We forgot she was the reason we got anywhere. John stirred his coffee but didn't drink. She should never have needed saving. That's the real failure. David leaned forward, elbows on the table. But you did something. That matters. And maybe it's not too late to make it mean more? He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket and slid it across the table. I've been working on this the last couple nights. It's an idea, a fund for retired teachers in crisis. To cover rent, medicine, heating bills, we start with her name. The Graves Foundation. John scanned the paper, then looked up. You think people will care? David nodded. They will, because it's not just her. There are more, and we all have stories. That afternoon, David started reaching out. Group chats came alive, emails flew. Names that hadn't been mentioned in years resurfaced with surprising speed. Within days, stories poured in from former students, short, emotional, heartfelt. Angela Price, now a single mom of 2, wrote that Ms. Graves had convinced the principal to give her one more chance after she was caught with alcohol in her locker. She'd gone on to finish school, get her GED, and eventually open her own daycare. Thomas Brooks, now a novelist living in Chicago, said Ms. Graves had slipped one of his short stories into the school newspaper without telling him. She was the first person who called me a writer. Then there was Carlos Dominguez, who had bounced in and out of trouble since age 12. Ms. Graves had stayed after school 3 days a week, tutoring him one-on-one. He ended his message with, "If not for her, I'd probably be in jail or dead." The momentum grew. More voices joined in. People donated. Some sent letters. Others volunteered to help manage the logistics. What started as a favor had turned into something that breathed on its own. A week later, David organized a small gathering at Eleanor's new apartment. He didn't give her many details, just asked her to come outside at 4 o'clock. John convinced her it was nothing big, just some folks stopping by. Eleanor opened her front door and stepped out, cardigan buttoned up, hair neat, eyes wide with confusion as she saw the crowd waiting under the oaks by the curb. Dozens of people, men and women, some dressed in suits, others in work uniforms, clapped softly as she approached. Is this all for me?" she asked. David stepped forward with a microphone clipped to a small speaker. "We wanted to say thank you, Miss Graves, for every lunch you skipped to help us study, for every note you wrote on our papers, for seeing something in us before we saw it in ourselves." Eleanor brought her hand to her chest. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," David said. "We're here to speak." One by one, people took turns stepping forward. Short, honest moments, some funny, some tender. One man recited a poem he wrote in her class. A woman held up a photo of her high school diploma, tears in her eyes. Then David cleared his throat. "We've created something called the Graves Foundation in your name, to help other teachers who gave everything and were left with nothing. It's already fully funded for the first year, and it's just getting started." Eleanor's hands trembled. Her eyes welled with tears that finally spilled down her cheeks. She tried to speak, but her voice cracked, and she simply covered her mouth, overwhelmed. The crowd applauded gently, not out of celebration, but out of deep respect. John stood in the back, near the edge of the group, watching. He didn't step forward, didn't speak. But Eleanor found him in the crowd, moved toward him, and placed her hand gently on his. "You were always meant for more than vengeance, John," she said softly. "You were meant to restore." He didn't answer right away, but as her hand lingered, something inside him shifted. Not a roar, not even a whisper, just a warmth, quiet and steady where there had once been only cold. The morning sun filtered through thin curtains, casting soft lines across the wooden floor. Eleanor stood by the window of her new apartment, one hand resting lightly on the windowsill, the other holding a cup of tea. The space around her felt lived in already, even though she'd only been there a few days. There were books stacked by the reading chair in the corner, a colorful quilt draped across the couch, and a potted rosemary plant on the kitchen windowsill. Her apartment sat on the second floor of a quiet building nestled beneath two old maple trees. Outside, birds flitted between branches, and the occasional car rolled slowly by. It wasn't grand, but it was warm, peaceful. She hadn't imagined having anything like this again. Not after everything. But here she was, surrounded by books and light and the quiet kind of dignity that once seemed forever out of reach. She moved slowly but steadily now, a noticeable lightness in her steps. The aches still came and went, but the constant weight pressing on her chest worry, loneliness, fear of being forgotten, that had lifted. Across town, John remained a ghost in the system. No public thanks, no interviews, no photos. He didn't want them. He watched from the edges, making sure Eleanor had everything she needed. Each month, a package arrived at her door. Wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine, no return address. Inside, a novel. Always a classic. Always accompanied by a handwritten note on cream-colored stationery. She never told anyone about the notes. Those were just for her. Her prescriptions began arriving on time, always paid for. The receptionist at the clinic mentioned a new insurance sponsor, but never gave a name. Eleanor suspected who it was, of course, but she never asked. She knew better than to pry into Grace. Weeks passed. Then one afternoon a letter arrived for John, no name on the envelope, but he knew the handwriting before he even opened it. Slanted, neat, the same penmanship that once filled the margins of his high school essays with encouragement and quiet corrections. He sat on a park bench under the shade of a broad elm and unfolded the letter slowly, the way one would handle something fragile. The paper felt soft, like it had lived in someone's drawer for a long time before finding its way to him. The letter was short but deliberate. "You once told me that justice was for the strong," it began. "I've thought about that ever since. I used to believe you were wrong. Now I think we were both half right. Justice isn't just for the strong, it's for the grateful, for the ones brave enough to remember the forgotten. That kind of courage matters more than strength, it always has. Thank you, John, for remembering." He read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it back into the envelope. His eyes drifted across the park where a mother pushed her child on a swing and two older men played chess at a nearby table. Everything around him moved gently, without urgency. That evening, as the sun began to lower and cast long shadows across the pavement, John found himself walking past a high school he didn't recognize. But it looked like every school he'd ever known: red brick, tall fences, tired banners fluttering over the entrance. A group of students spilled out the front doors, laughing, shouting to each other. One of them dropped a book near the curb. Another kid, without hesitation, stopped and picked it up for him, handing it back with a quick smile. John stopped walking. He watched the exchange, simple as it was, and felt something loosen in his chest. Not a tear, not a tremble, just a soft easing of something old and long held. Then he smiled, not the sharp-guarded kind, a real one, the kind that crept in without effort. And then, without ceremony, he turned the corner and disappeared into the crowd. Somewhere in the background, if this were a story told aloud, a voice might have said, "Not all battles are fought with fists. Some are won with memory, with honor, with gratitude. That's the justice that lasts." And perhaps for a moment, someone listening would understand that kindness, quiet, enduring kindness can leave a deeper mark than any scar. Sometimes the people who shape our lives the most do it quietly, without ever asking for thanks. Miss Graves was one of those people. And John? He reminded us that true justice isn't always loud. It can be as simple as remembering someone who once believed in you. So here's a question for you. Is there someone in your past, maybe a teacher, a neighbor, or a friend you haven't thought about in a while, but who helped you become who you are today? Tell us in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to Covert Truth so you won't miss the next story that might just touch your heart or open your eyes.